The cold wind bit at the exposed skin of Julian's face as he adjusted his worn scarf. The streets of the city were bustling despite the chill, and he found himself wandering near the upscale district. It wasn't unusual for him to pass through these parts, people with lives so unlike his own rushing past in tailored coats and polished shoes. The disparity didn't sting anymore. He had learned to accept it. Julian was an artist by heart. He spent his days sketching on scraps of paper, creating worlds that felt far warmer than the one he lived in. Tonight, though, he had little hope of finding inspiration. His stomach growled faintly as he tucked his hands deeper into his pockets. He was just about to turn back toward the shelter when he heard a muffled shout coming from an alleyway ahead. Curiosity overtook caution as he crept toward the sound. A man in an expensive coat was pinned against the wall by two shadowy figures. The glint of a knife flashed under the streetlight. "Wallet now," one of the assailants growled. The man hesitated, fear stark on his face. Julian felt a strange surge of protectiveness. Before he could think better of it, he grabbed a loose wooden plank leaning against a dumpster and stepped into the alley. "Hey!" Julian shouted, his voice steadier than he expected. "Back off, or I'm calling the cops." The two men turned to him, their eyes narrowing in disdain. Julian didn't falter. He raised the plank higher, his grip tightening. Something in his stance must have given them pause because, after a tense moment, they muttered curses under their breath and fled. The man in the coat exhaled shakily, his shoulders sagging. Julian lowered the makeshift weapon and stepped closer, unsure of what to say. "You okay?" he asked softly. The man nodded, though his hands still trembled as he adjusted his lapels. "I think so. That was thank you. Truly." Julian shrugged. "It's nothing. You should be more careful around here." The man's eyes finally focused on Julian, taking in his rumpled clothes and tired expression. "I should. You didn't have to do that." "Someone had to," Julian said simply. "Look, just get somewhere safe, all right?" The man hesitated, glancing at Julian's face as though trying to play something about him. Then he extended his hand. "My name's Evan. Evan Locke." Julian stared at the hand for a moment before shaking it briefly. "Julian," Evan seemed reluctant to leave, his gaze flickering over Julian's tattered coat and scuffed shoes. "Can I do something to repay you? At least let me buy you dinner." Julian bristled at the offer, his pride rearing its head. "I don't need charity." "It's not charity," Evan insisted. "It's gratitude. Please." The sincerity in Evan's tone softened Julian's defenses. His stomach growled again, as if casting the deciding vote. "Fine," Julian relented. "Just dinner?" The diner Evan chose was one of the few places still open at this hour. It was clean and cozy, with a faint scent of coffee and warm bread wafting through the air. Julian couldn't remember the last time he had sat somewhere like this. The waitress gave Evan an approving once-over, her demeanor a little warmer than usual as she handed the menus. Julian wasn't used to being in places like this, and it showed. He fidgeted with the edge of the laminated menu, avoiding Evan's gaze. Meanwhile, Evan watched him, his expression unreadable. "You're an artist," Evan said suddenly. Julian looked up, startled. "What?" "The sketchbook," Evan clarified, gesturing to the edges of a well-worn pad peeking out of Julian's bag. "I noticed it earlier." Julian felt a flicker of defensiveness. "Yeah, I draw." Evan smiled faintly. "That's impressive. I can barely manage stick figures." Julian huffed a quiet laugh despite himself. "It's not much. Just something to pass the time. May I see?" Julian hesitated. No one had ever asked to see his work, at least not in a genuine way. Finally, he pulled out the sketchbook and slid it across the table. Evan opened it carefully, his fingers brushing over the charcoal lines. He lingered on a sketch of a tree, its branches curling into intricate designs that seemed almost alive. Another drawing depicted a cityscape, its details so vivid that Evan felt as though he could hear the hum of traffic. "These are incredible," Evan said, his voice low and reverent. "You have real talent." Julian shifted uncomfortably in his seat. "They're just doodles." "They're not," Evan said firmly, closing the book and meeting Julian's eyes. "You could do something with this." Julian laughed, but there was no humor in it. Yeah, sure. People are just lining up to hire starting artists. Evan didn't laugh. Instead, he studied Julian with an intensity that made him squirm. You're better than you think you are. The waitress arrived with their food, breaking the moment. Julian dove into his plate with more enthusiasm than he meant to, the warmth of real food chasing away some of his discomfort. So, Evan said after a while, "Where do you stay?" Julian's fork paused midair. "Why do you care?" Evan leaned back, his expression open but unreadable. "You saved me tonight. I'm just trying to understand you." Julian sighed, his defenses crumbling slightly. "I stay wherever I can. Shelters sometimes. The streets mostly." Evan's jaw tightened. "That's no way for someone like you to live." Julian bristled again. "Someone like me?" "Someone with talent," Evan said simply. "Someone with a heart big enough to help a stranger." The words disarmed Julian. He looked down at his plate, unsure how to respond. No one had ever spoken to him like that before. "I don't need saving," Julian said finally, though his voice lacked conviction. "Maybe not," Evan replied. "But everyone deserves a chance." By the time they left the diner, the air had grown colder. Evan insisted on walking Julian to the shelter, even though Julian protested the entire way. "This is unnecessary," Julian said. "It's late," Evan countered. "Humor me?" When they reached the shelter, Julian stopped just outside the door. He turned to Evan, unsure what to say. "Thanks," Julian muttered. "For dinner?" Evan smiled, his hands in his coat pockets. "Thank you. For saving me?" They stood there for a moment, the silence stretching between them. Then Evan pulled out a business card and handed it to Julian. "If you ever need anything," Evan said, "call me." Julian stared at the card, the weight of the gesture sinking in. He nodded, slipping it into his pocket. As Evan walked away, Julian found himself wondering why a man like that, polished, successful, and clearly from a different world, had taken such an interest in him. For the first time in a long time, Julian felt something stir within him. Hope, maybe, or perhaps something even more complicated. Julian stared at the card Evan had handed him long after he disappeared into the night. The embossed lettering, sleek and professional, seemed so out of place in his calloused hands. He slipped it into his bag with a sigh and entered the shelter, hoping the warmth inside would calm his racing thoughts. For days, Julian couldn't shake the memory of Evan. His kind words lingered like an unfamiliar melody, and his presence felt more like a dream than reality. But life didn't allow much time for daydreaming. Julian returned to his routine, sketching, finding food, and surviving. One afternoon, while sketching in the park, Julian felt a shadow fall over his paper. Looking up, he saw a familiar face. "Evan?" he asked, surprised. Evan stood there, dressed casually in a sweater and jeans. He smiled, a mix of relief and happiness lighting up his features. "I hoped I'd find you here." Julian raised an eyebrow. "You were looking for me?" Evan nodded, sitting on the bench beside him. "I couldn't stop thinking about you." Julian chuckled nervously. "You're not exactly easy to forget either." Evan glanced at the sketch in Julian's hands, a delicate portrait of an elderly couple walking hand in hand. "You've been busy." Julian shrugged. "It's what I do." Evan studied him for a moment, then leaned forward. "Julian, have you thought about what I said? About your talent?" Julian hesitated. "Look, I appreciate your faith in me, but people like me don't just get opportunities handed to them." Evan's expression softened. "What if someone opened a door for you? Would you walk through it?" Julian looked at him skeptically. "What kind of door?" Evan smiled. "Come with me. I'll show you." Evan led Julian to a sprawling gallery in the heart of the city. The building's modern design and glass facade made Julian feel out of place, but Evan walked confidently, guiding him inside. The gallery was bustling with activity. Artists displayed their work, and patrons mingled, sipping wine and discussing brushstrokes. Julian couldn't help but gawk at the vibrant paintings and sculptures that lined the walls. "Why are we here?" Julian whispered. Evan turned to him, his smile warm. "This is where you belong." Julian froze. "What? No, I can't." "You can," Evan interrupted. "I talked to the curator. They're always looking for new talent. Show them your work." Julian clutched his sketchbook tightly. "These are just sketches. They're more than that. Evan insisted. Trust me. With Evan's encouragement, Julian approached the curator, a sharp-eyed woman who studied his drawings with intense interest. Her expression softened as she flipped through the pages. This is remarkable, she said finally. Raw, honest, and deeply emotional. We'd be honored to feature your work in our next showcase. Julian stared at her, stunned. Are you serious? Absolutely, she replied. But I'll need more pieces. Can you manage that? Julian nodded numbly. Yeah, I think I can. Evan clapped him on the back. I knew you could. Over the next few weeks, Evan became a constant presence in Julian's life. He visited regularly, bringing food, supplies, and most importantly, support. Julian worked tirelessly on his art, pouring his soul into every piece. Evan, in turn, helped him secure a small studio space, a place where he could work without interruption. Their bond deepened with each passing day. Evan's easy laughter became a source of comfort, and Julian's sarcastic humor drew out smiles that Evan didn't even realize he was holding back. They shared late-night conversations over cheap takeout, talking about everything from art to life's uncertainties. One evening, as Julian was adding the final touches to a painting, he paused and looked at Evan. Why are you doing this? Evan tilted his head. Doing what? Helping me, Julian said. You don't owe me anything. Evan leaned against the wall, his gaze thoughtful. Maybe I don't, but I wanna. You have something special, Julian. The world deserves to see it. Julian's throat tightened. No one's ever believed in me like this before. Evan smiled gently. Then it's about time someone did. The day of the gallery showcase arrived, and Julian felt a mix of excitement and terror. His paintings hung on the walls alongside seasoned artists, each one a testament to his journey. The room was packed with art enthusiasts and critics, their chatter filling the air. Julian stood awkwardly near the corner, unsure how to handle the attention. Evan stayed close, offering quiet reassurance. Your work speaks for itself, Evan said. You don't have to do anything but be here. As the night progressed, Julian overheard snippets of conversations about his art. Words like raw, authentic, and captivating. He couldn't believe they were talking about his work. Toward the end of the evening, a man in a suit approached him. Mr. Julian, your pieces are extraordinary. I'd like to purchase this one for my personal collection. Julian blinked, stunned. You want to buy it? The man nodded. Absolutely. Julian glanced at Evan, who grinned and gave him a thumbs up. The deal was made, and Julian felt a surge of pride he had never experienced before. In the weeks that followed, Julian's life changed dramatically. His art gained recognition, and more opportunities came his way. He moved into a modest apartment, finally leaving behind the uncertainty of the streets. Through it all, Evan remained by his side. One evening, as they sat on the balcony of Julian's new place, watching the city lights, a comfortable silence enveloped them. The air was crisp but not cold, the kind of evening that invited quiet reflection. Julian turned to Evan, his voice soft. I couldn't have done any of this without you. Evan shook his head, his expression thoughtful. You did this, Julian. I just gave you a little push. Julian smiled, his heart full. You're more than a push. You're everything. Evan's gaze softened, but this time, he didn't reply right away. Instead, he leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees, his hands clasped. His usual confidence seemed to waver, replaced by something quieter, something more vulnerable. Evan hesitated, then turned to him, his expression serious. Julian, I need to tell you something. I've been trying to hold back, but I can't anymore. I care about you, more than as a friend. I'm in love with you. Julian blinked, his heart skipping a beat. You're serious? Evan nodded, his voice steady now. I've never felt this way about anyone. I just didn't know how to tell you. Julian studied him for a moment, then smiled. Evan, you didn't need to tell me. I knew it. Evan's shoulders relaxed, his face lighting up. You do. I do, and I love you too, Julian said simply. You've been my anchor through everything. I can't imagine my life without you. Evan grinned, his confidence returning. Then let's not waste any more time. Julian chuckled, leaning back. Together? Together, Evan confirmed. And just like that, the weight of uncertainty melted away. In that quiet moment, they both realized they weren't just walking into the future. They were building it together.